Okay, time being 10:44 a.m. I'd like to call this meeting back to order. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Russell Yee for his interview this morning. Dr. Yee, can you hear us okay?
I can, thank you.
Great, thank you. Welcome and thank you for being here this morning. I'd like to turn the time over to Mr. Dawson for the 5 standard questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Yee, I am going to ask you 5 standard questions that the panel has requested each applicant respond to. Are you ready, sir?
Yes, I am.
First question. What skills and attributes should all commissioners possess? What skills or competencies should the commission possess collectively? Of the skills, attributes, and competencies that each commissioner should possess, which do you possess? In summary, how will you contribute to the success of the commission?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for persevering under these difficult circumstances. I think the 2020 Commission will definitely need the qualities that the panel has focused on in its materials. Those are impartiality, analytical ability, and an appreciation for California's diversity. As I've researched the work of the 2010 Commission and have been so impressed by their success and what they were able to achieve, certainly they used excellent teamwork. I was very impressed by how they used rotating chairs and so forth. They had good use of technical skills, not necessarily the commission itself, but the consultants and contractors and people they used and the mappers. They made a good use of those resources and were able to interpret and use their results. But it seems to me what was most important to the success of the 2010 Commission and what will be most important to the success of the 2020 Commission is perseverance, perseverance to the goal. The 2010 Commission really faced significant obstacles and challenges at just about every step of its work. And they persevered, and especially at the end when the timeline became seemingly impossible. They burned the midnight oil and were able to deliver the 4 maps in time, and those maps have stood the test of time. So when it comes to my own possible contributions to the 2020 Commission, I'd like to mention 5. The first one that I can mention is contributing to that perseverance that will be needed, perseverance to the goal. And if I'm selected, I can promise that I will give the Commission, 2020 Commission, my 100% full-time attention. I'll be able to put my teaching work aside for the full year, that the main work will be done. And I intend to attend 100% of the Commission meetings. I believe the 2010 Commission had about 34 public input meetings and around 70 business meetings. I will be prepared, ready, willing, and able to attend 100% of those. One of the 2010 commissioners described the work as all-consuming, all-consuming, which sounds very daunting, but I'm ready for that. I've been in any number of meetings over the years, and I've decided that meetings are physical work. They're not aerobic, unfortunately, but they are physical effort. And this commission will certainly have its share of meetings, and I'm up to that. As it happens, I was actually scheduled to run the Boston Marathon in 4 days, which has now been postponed. But marathon running, which is a big part of my life, has taught me a lot about perseverance, mental and physical perseverance. And I certainly intend to apply those lessons to the work of this commission if I'm chosen. In all my years of education and work, I've learned that while skills and talents are important, nothing can substitute for perseverance. And so that's the first quality I think the commission will need. The second quality is impartiality, and I think I'll be saying more about that as I respond to the second question. But I'll mention here that aspiring to this commission is by far the most political thing I've ever done, and other than voting. And so I find that I was motivated by this opportunity precisely because it's nonpartisan, precisely because it's fundamentally emphatically nonpartisan. And by being on this commission, I would have an opportunity to be on everyone's side. That nonpartisan nature of this commission is like its superpower, and I'm really attracted by that and really drawn to that. So impartiality. The third quality I can bring to the commission is analytical ability, and just my scholarly skills and instincts for research and analysis and presentation and summary. The 20th Commission had to do a lot of learning and learning about the Voting Rights Act and so forth. And I am certainly ready and interested and motivated to do that. I love gathering evidence and making lists and writing down pros and cons and writing reports even. All of that really motivates me. I'm always looking for the best way to say things clearly and find the best ways to express things. I've discovered on the U.S. Census website, there's an online academy, and I've been spending some of my shelter-in-place time working through the modules there on the U.S. Census Online Academy and learning about how to use their system. I also bring to the analytical ability, I think I can also bring a historical perspective. So I'm a history docent at the Oakland Museum of California, and I think a lot of the Commission's work, especially around communities of interest, will involve trying to understand those communities, including how they got the way they are and why they are the way they are, and that will involve some historical perspective. And I think I can bring that aspect of analytical ability to the Commission's work. So that's analytical ability. The fourth thing I think I can bring is an appreciation for California's diversity. I'll be responding to more about that, I think, in a later question. But I can just mention here that I've spent my whole life here in Oakland, and Oakland has not had a majority race since 1980, and so I've spent most of my life in a very multicultural, multiracial setting. And I went to all public schools, and I continue to circulate in racially and economically mixed settings. And so for me, diversity is a given. And I think the work of the Commission, part of that will be going to places that actually aren't very diverse. And that's part of California's diversity too. And so that will be a little more of a stretch for me, but that's part of California as well. Lastly, I think I can bring my love for California. I love our state. And I love that 5 generations of my family have been here in California. And 3 of those generations, native-born Californians. I love being a history docent at the Oakland Museum of California. Here's my docent badge. And I love telling California's story over and over. I never get tired of telling California's story to our visitors and guests. I'm really proud that we Californians have proven that nonpartisan citizen redistricting can work. And we now offer that as a model to other states, even though we're the most populous and most complex state in many ways, and yet we showed that it can work. Last month, I served as an election poll worker in the March primary election. And I was so proud of how California really bends over backwards to help people vote. And we allow for same-day registration, we allow for permanent mail-in ballots, and so on and so forth. And I was very proud of our state and how we approach that. And so with all of that, and with nonpartisan citizen redistricting, I want to help California lead the nation in advancing voting rights and political equality through nonpartisan redistricting. And if I'm chosen for this commission, I very much think of it as a 10-year commitment, not just a 1-year commitment. And I very much would look forward to, even after the mapping's done, look forward to representing the commission and sharing its work for the rest of the decade. So in summary, I believe I can contribute to the commission's success through perseverance, impartiality, analytical ability, an appreciation for California's diversity, and my love for California.
Thank you. Question 2. Work on the commission requires members of different political backgrounds to work together. Since the 2010 commission was selected and formed, the American political conversation has become increasingly polarized, whether in the press, on social media, and even in our own families. What characteristics do you possess, and what characteristics should your fellow commissioners possess that will protect against hyperpartisanship? What will you do to ensure that the work of the Commission is not seen as polarized or hyperpartisan, and avoid perceptions of political bias and conflict?
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Yes, so I'll start off by saying I have been very personally and directly affected by this hyperpartisanship and all these political debates, and I know that they're a huge challenge and that there are no easy answers. One of the areas where I've been affected is at my church, and it's a church that happens to attract people from a wide range of backgrounds, political persuasions, and temperaments. And so at that church, I was the church board chairperson, from 2015 to 2019. And so that was during the years of the 2016 election and all the drama and rancor over that, Black Lives Matter protests, further protests around immigration and what was happening on our borders, our own Oakland debates over homelessness and housing and so forth. So a lot of drama, and in our church, a lot of strong feelings, a lot of division. And so as church board chairperson, my challenge and my goal was to promote what I call a diverse unity. I didn't think we all had to agree, but we all had to, as I put it, stay uncomfortable together. That was my goal and my conviction. At one point, I was called upon to write an open letter to the church, and I did. And in that letter, I included a picture of a mobile, which I brought a copy of it. So there's one of the Alexander Calder mobiles in the National Gallery of Art. And the point I made with that illustration was that we're all like the pieces on the mobile that have to stay balanced, and we all need each other. And no matter how strong our feelings, one side or the other, only by being together and being willing to be uncomfortable together could we grow together. And to this day, some years later, some people still will refer to the mobile letter at our church. So I feel very deeply and personally that need for balance. I think I've earned a reputation as being fair-minded and even-tempered and inclusive. When it comes to the commission itself, here's I could think of 5 ways that I think it can promote that kind of balance and avoid hyperpartisanship and perceptions of bias conflict. First way, I think certainly to speak and act in a consistently nonpartisan fashion. I think about my experience last month as a poll worker, and of course that was a primary election, so there were different ballots depending on one's party. And as a poll worker, you greet a voter and you have to find out which ballot they want, and you get that ballot for them. And my goal as I did that was that no voter should be able to tell, my own party or leanings, what I said, even very subtle tones of voice should not give anybody any indication what party I was registered as. And that would be my goal for the commission in its public hearings and public meetings. We should not give the public, it should be pretty hard, maybe even impossible for anyone just listening to our discussions to guess what our political affiliations are. That would be my goal. We should all come across as representing all of California and doing nonpartisan work. So that would be my first thought for the commission. My second thought is to follow open meeting laws by the letter and by the spirit. I guess that's the Bagley-Keene Act. And I know that can be frustrating. I remember serving on a jury some years ago. It was a 9-week trial, and we were instructed not to discuss the evidence at all, for 9 weeks, even among ourselves, which was really hard. But we did that, and there are good reasons for that, and I kept to those rules. As well, I think we need to be very self-disciplined about social media. Of course, not post anything about the commission's work, but also, and especially because this is an election year, to not post anything that will come across as partisan, because somebody will find that and find out that we're on the commission, and that would reflect poorly on the commission. So we need self-discipline about that. So that's my second thought. Third thought, as we schedule public meetings, public input meetings, of course, will need to be clearly representative of the state as far as we can. We can't go everywhere, but to have a clear balance of different regions and different rural, suburban, urban, different communities of interest and so forth. Fourth thing, I think in meetings, to do a lot of excellent listening. We're there to listen, we're there to understand, not there to debate, not there to air our own opinions. And so to listen, to always assume positive intent from those who are presenting, to really look for the values behind what they're saying and try to appreciate those values, and go with that kind of attitude. Lastly, I think even physical settings convey a sense of partiality or impartiality. I think one of the suggestions from the 2010 Commission was to have mix the seating of the commissioners at each meeting, so there's no patterns. It's not like Congress, with an aisle in between this side and that side and all that. But to mix the seating, and also in terms of physical settings, I find I pay a lot of attention to things like lighting and sound and projected material and so forth. And I think as we go to different parts of the state, to really treat each meeting, to do our very best job at each meeting of conveying that the setting is worth our full effort, that we're doing a good job, even in the hosting of the meeting and the physical setting of the meeting, and show that we are treating all the different settings equally. So those are some of the ways I think the Commission can avoid hyperpartisanship and perceptions of bias and conflict.
Thank you. Madam Secretary?
Yes, we have 13 minutes, 35 seconds remaining.
Thank you. Question 3. What is the greatest problem the Commission could encounter, and what actions would you take to avoid or respond to this problem?
Well, suddenly, COVID-19, that's probably going to be a huge issue for this Commission. And, we're going to have to do a lot more video meetings. And I think the outreach to get public input will very probably have to rely a lot more on online input. So that's going to be a new challenge for this Commission. There's also just the tightness of the deadlines that the 2010 Commission faced, and their advice to this Commission was to really start early, do the hiring of staff early, get consultants on board early, do the Voting Rights Act training early, and so forth. I did notice this week, just on Monday, there is a possibility that the census data for redistricting will be delayed. The Secretary of Commerce has asked for a 120-day delay, and so that would put the data release to the end of July, and the maps are currently due in August. So, I don't know if the legislature will have to do something about that, but we'll certainly have to keep track of that. I think there's also a question of funding. Will funding being adequate? I think the 2010 Commission enjoyed a large grant from the James Irvine Foundation, and that was almost a quarter of its budget. So I don't know if that grant is going to be available this time, and with the pandemic as well, how state tax revenues are affecting the funding of this Commission. So those are all issues that we'll have to face.
Thank you. Question 4. If you are selected, you will be one of 14 members of the Commission, which is charged with working together to create maps of the new districts. Please describe a situation where you had to work collaboratively with others on a project to achieve a common goal. Tell us the goal of the project, what your role in the group was, and how the group worked through any conflicts that arose. What lessons would you take from this group experience to the Commission if selected?
So I'd like to tell you about my experience at one of my former churches, not the one I'm at currently, but a former church where I was the pastor. And that church was a startup. And early in its life, we decided we wanted to affiliate with a larger church body, a denomination. And it would be sort of like if you had a community service organization that had been going for a while and decided it really wanted to affiliate with a larger body. And so we looked into Kiwanis and Rotary and Lions Club and so forth to try to decide on a larger organization to become part of. So that's the position we were in. It was a big challenge because the members of the church had come from different backgrounds, Presbyterians and Baptists and so forth, and had strong feelings about that. So there was no guarantee at the beginning of the process that we were going to be able to agree on anything. And even if we did agree, it was not I was pretty sure we would lose at least some people because of just the nature of the decision. So we took a full year to work through the process. We had a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, did a lot of research into our options, went through kind of predictable stages of a community process where people test the waters, they say things, they find out we don't all agree. At some point you feel stuck. You have to persevere through that. And in the end, we were able to do a lot of learning together, a lot of growing together. And at the end, we took a vote of the whole membership, and we did make a decision. It was actually not the choice that I had originally supported, so my own mind had been changed by the process. And most amazingly to me, we actually didn't lose anyone. So that was just quite an inspiring experience. So some lessons for the commission. I think you have to not fear differences of opinion, and you have to be willing to sit with them and work through them and persevere through them. I think people really notice how you treat others, and so in a community input meeting, let's say, people really notice if your tone of voice, whether you're giving people plenty of time to share, things like that. I think the commission would need to, really surprise people with kindness and openness and patience and generosity and the ability to listen, approachability. I learned that people's minds can change. My mind changed, and that people's first answer is not necessarily their last answer. I learned that people's values behind their choices, are actually what are driving their choices. Sometimes if you can get those values, understand them, and be creative about ways to honor those values that may involve different choices, and that counts for a lot. I also learned that feeling heard and understood is more important than winning. So even if some people had voted no to our decision at the church, I think that would have been okay as long as they felt heard and understood. That's more important than everyone getting their way. And so I think on the commission that would certainly be the case as well.
Thank you. Question 5. A considerable amount of the commission's work will involve meeting with people from all over California who come from very different backgrounds and a wide variety of perspectives. If you are selected as a commissioner, what skills and attributes will make you effective at interacting with people from different backgrounds and who have a variety of perspectives? What experiences have you had that will help you be effective at understanding and appreciating people and communities of different backgrounds and who have a variety of perspectives?
So as I mentioned earlier, as an Oakland native, diversity is a norm for me. And everywhere I go in the course of the day, normally, not right now, I'm encountering people of different races, languages, cultures, so on and so forth. My teaching and writing have included quite a bit of attention to matters of culture and cultural understanding, cultural expression, cultural identity. I have especially focused on Asian American identity and culture, as well as Southeast Asian American identity and culture. So the fact that this week is actually Cambodian New Year this week is part of the landscape of my life. As an Asian American, I have a particular awareness of immigrant stories and generational differences and changes, immigrant populations. California is 1/4 foreign-born today, and the highest in the nation, highest percentage. And so that world of people from elsewhere and their kids and grandkids, that's a normal part of life for me. It's familiar territory for me. As a racial minority, I have an awareness of settings and majority versus minority cultures, and stepping into a setting who treats that setting as belonging to them versus those who feel like outsiders, those you have to invite in versus those who come in assuming that they're included, and so forth. I can mention that my postgraduate degrees came from 2 very different institutions, a master's degree from Dallas Theological Seminary and a doctoral degree from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And together, those 2 would cover an extremely wide range of the religious and cultural, political spectrum constituencies in Christian circles, far right to far left. And I've circulated in those circles, that whole range, and have connections in that whole range. So that's part of my background. Being at my current church definitely puts me outside my comfort zone, and there's a range of political and temperaments there, political opinions and temperaments there, socioeconomic range. I'm actually one of the older members there now, so the generational differences and so forth. I have traveled quite a bit throughout California my whole life. My honeymoon 33 years ago was actually a road trip in California. One of my daughters just finished up her college degree in Southern Cal, so I spent a lot of time down there, as well as doing some teaching in Southern Cal myself and other work there. I can also mention as a runner, everywhere I go, I like to run. My wife and I were just in Hollister earlier this year, some running there. And when you run, you see things up close that you don't see, when you're driving through a place. And certainly, if we're able to have on-site meetings with this commission and public input meetings, any overnight travel I'll do to any of those meetings. I certainly look forward to running in those places and seeing those communities up close. Not only for the pleasure of it, but also as part of my research to those communities. Some other things specifically for the commission, I think it counts a lot when you go to a place to show active interest in that place, do your homework, find out the background of the place. If it's a small town, find out, the mascot of the high school there, things like that. And find out what the current issues are and come prepared. Coming into a community, know the community organizations that are there, connect with the leaders of those organizations before you get there, and get their endorsement and participation if possible. Then just do a lot of outreach to those communities. Invite again, invite 5, 10 different ways, and because everyone's different and people circulate in different circles, they take in information in different ways and make different assumptions. So the commission will definitely need to do that. And so try to reach as many different communities of interest and different people and perspectives as possible.
Thank you. We'll now go to panel questions. Each panel member will have 20 minutes to ask his or her questions. We'll start with the chair, Mr. Coe.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson. Once again, good morning to you, Dr. Yu. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. I wanted to ask you about your role as a history docent at the Oakland Museum of California. You talked about it a couple of times this morning. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more information about your duties in this role.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Coe. So we do, the main duty is leading tours. And the bread and butter is school group tours, 4th grade tours. And I love it. 4th grade is a great age. Kids are curious, they can absorb quite a bit, but they're still, they're not teenagers yet, so. And so the Oakland Museum of California, so there's 2 museums dedicated to California as a state. One is the California Museum in Sacramento, and the other is the Oakland Museum of California. So we have 3 galleries at our museum, Art of California, the Natural Science of California, and then the History of California. So I'm a docent in the History Gallery, and we lead these tours. And, we get school groups from all over the greater Bay Area, all different towns and school districts, all different socioeconomics. But I love most of all the groups that include kids from immigrant families, and you can have a tour group of 7 kids who are from 7 different, these families are from 7 different countries. And it's just spectacular and amazing and beautiful. And I love that. And some of these kids, it's their very first experience of any museum, anywhere. And I have the honor, of introducing them to that experience. the Oakland Museum, one of our taglines is the Museum of You, which is a little cheesy, but it's, the idea is that every Californian is part of the California story. And that's part of what we try to convey to the school kids. This is their story. This is not somebody else's story. This is their story. And all the different parts of it, the good parts, the not so good parts, that's all part of their story. And it's an unfolding story that they get to continue helping to tell. So those are some of our duties.
Now, what's your favorite subject to speak to the public about in your role?
Favorite subject? Certainly Native American backgrounds and present Native American life, which of course is a very mixed story and a very heartbreaking story in a lot of ways. But our museum has done a particularly good job of that, portraying that. The very first thing you see as you enter the history gallery is a display of a Ohlone Tule reed boat, and the caption over the boat is, and the caption for the first section of the history gallery is, "Before the other people came," before the other people came, and and of course, starting off with the Native American story. So I like to start off there. We have a video there of some local Ohlone Native Americans welcoming guests to the gallery, welcoming them to the displays. And so I love to start there. Of course, we do a lot with the gold rush and try to explain that to kids and the complexity of it and just the drama of it and how it changed California. Other parts of our history, I love taking them up to the present and showing them how it connects with the past and how even gold is still very much a part of our life here in California and in the high-tech industry, and how it's used in industrial processes. I also like just impressing on them that people keep coming to California, right? And with aspirations, with dreams, with hopes of a better life for themselves and their families, and that we're all connected in those ways.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. I want to talk about your impartiality essay for a moment. Mm-hmm. In that essay, you write that you have had endless opportunities to practice listening to different sides, speaking your own convictions, and coming to decisions even with imperfect and incomplete data. And as we've talked about a delay in census or maybe some issues with census data as a result of the pandemic, making decisions with imperfect and incomplete data seems to be a pertinent topic here. But my question to you is kind of a double question, and I'm wondering if you can give us an example of a time where you had to set aside your personal beliefs or your preferences in order to make a difficult decision with imperfect or incomplete data. And the second part to that question is, as part of the decision making for that example that you're going to give us, what process did you employ to ensure that you made the best decision possible with the data that was available?
Sure, thank you. Wow. For sure, the example I gave of the denominational decision at my former church, that was an example of making a decision, and we took a whole year. We got lots of data, but of course, there's always more to get. And at some point, you just have to make a decision. And so we did that. Another example, more recent, might be, so at my current church, a decision we faced came when, so we, as it happens at our church site, we're a block away from a halfway house. And it's a facility where folks who are newly on parole can spend some time living as they get reentry experience into jobs and so forth. And at one point a few years ago, some of the men at that reentry facility started coming to our church. And so these are paroled lifers, folks who had life sentences but had earned parole, and so they were now out and coming to our church. And we had no experience with this in the past at the church, and so we had to make a decision how to respond to their presence and how to include them and whether or not to invite them into small fellowship groups that we have at the church and so forth. It was right around the time we had a our church retreat, going off to a spot in the Redwoods and spending a weekend together. And okay, would we make that special effort to include these parolees? And we did research, talked to people, but we had to make a pretty quick decision, just because of the timeline. And so partly what informed our decision was just face-to-face discussions. And so we met with some of these men and had them educate us about their lives and the difference between short-timers and lifers and what it takes to earn parole, and all the supervision that their lives are under currently, and so forth. That was all news to us. And as we weighed that information, in the time we had, we didn't find out everything we wanted to or needed to, but we made the call in the end. Okay, we will embrace this group. We will treat them like everyone else. We will not have any special rules for them, And in the end, and this included hosting some of these men in my own home and for regular meetings. And we made that decision, and it's actually worked out well. So that's an example. I don't know. Maybe that'll do for now.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about something you mentioned in your Appreciation for Diversity essay that you sent to us. In that you discussed your seminary teachings and in how in those teachings you challenge assumptions some students have about the normativity of the majority culture or the uniformity of any given minority culture. So I'm curious, how do you challenge your students to think about this, and what generally are the results?
Excellent question. So, a lot of it has to do with people students who think of the majority culture as just the norm, and it's kind of as I put it, it's the way we use the term ethnic often. Ethnic churches, for instance, the term that's often used in church circles. And basically that's a reference to racial minority churches. Those are ethnic churches, but the implication is that a majority culture church doesn't have an ethnicity, which of course is not true. All churches have particular cultures, they have particular sensibilities about time and so forth. So one way I try to bring up the subject is by pointing out all of the things that a majority culture might do that are culturally specific and not just universal. So for instance, how do generations interact? In the majority culture, and especially here in the Bay Area, a lot of it from kind of the influence of Silicon Valley, we have a very non-hierarchical culture. People are on first name basis. It would not be unusual for young people to call adults by their first name and so forth. Whereas in other cultures, of course, you would use a title. You would never call a grandparent, or even a parent by a first name. And so on. So, just pointing out some of those differences and sensibilities and how specific they are, and trying to open people's eyes to how particular different aspects of the majority culture are. And so it's generally well received as people come to understand. People who are in ministry career aspirations, they want to understand people. They want to reach out and learn. And so it's generally well received that way, but certainly still some resistance or a sense that, the majority culture is somehow, privileged or better, or special in a way that should, keep it in some kind of privileged position. So just challenging those assumptions. At the same time, not to make all cultures relative. I think American culture has particular qualities that make it, our commitment to equality and free speech and liberty. I mean, those are particular things and special things. So I think, for instance, in community input meetings, as we reach out to communities that may not be used to going to community meetings, speaking up in public, part of being American and being in a mixture of cultures is teaching each other, challenging each other how to grow into that, that biculturality. And so, to encourage a community member who has never spoken up at a public meeting before to do so, and explain why it's a good idea and explain how it's safe and so on and so forth. So it goes both ways.
Thank you. And from your experiences in that role or in any other role where you've worked with diverse groups of people with a variety of backgrounds, what have you learned about the needs and desires and preferences of the diverse groups of people that you've met that you think would make you an effective representative for the diverse population of California on this commission?
Sure. I think the first thing I would bring in that regard is just a sensibility and a sensitivity to who thinks they belong and who doesn't. Who would think of a meeting, an official meeting, as somewhere they have a right to speak up and they're going to speak up there, versus someone who would have to be specially invited to come or to comment. Someone who would think of that as somebody else's business. I think of some of the Southeast Asian American people I've worked with, and especially those who came out of wartime situations, in Southeast Asia, and how some of the really negative experiences they've had with officials and governments in settings where they came from, predisposed them to not want to speak up, not want to share their name, not want to comment publicly. And so being sensitive to things like that. I think generationally too, being at my church, being one of the older members there, I keep having to challenge myself to understand how the world looks different for different generations. And so for myself, I think growing up, as a tail end of the baby boom, I grew up trusting institutions, trusting officials, trusting the police, and the younger generation has grown up in a very different world. And so I think in reaching out, especially to the younger generation, and understanding that they may start with an assumption of distrust, and so I would have, our job would be to go in and earn their trust, by trying to understand their particular issues and understand their doubts and questions, and to go in understanding that, they're not, they don't come in predisposed to just believe in the system and believe in the work that we're doing. So those are some of the things I would do.
Thank you very much. Similar question, but in regards to geographic diversity, and people in different regions of the state may have different concerns depending on where they lived, the things that are facing them and the challenges. I know that you said you were born in the Bay Area and still live in the Bay Area, so I'm curious to hear about your experiences in other regions of the state and what you've learned from the people in those regions about their perspectives and preferences that you think would make you an effective representative for them on this commission.
Sure. Yeah, so I am, my parents were born in Oakland. I was born in Oakland, so a lot of deep roots here. But as I mentioned, I have spent quite a bit of time in Southern California with relatives down there. I've done some teaching down there. I've been part of a nonprofit down there, based down there. And so quite a bit of time in Southern Cal. Also have visited, almost the whole state. I haven't been to the far northeast, and somehow I haven't made it to Death Valley, but through most of the rest of the state, I've traveled and enjoyed, I just enjoy so much traveling all throughout our state, our beautiful state. Certainly the urban versus suburban versus rural differences are very clear. Small towns, versus big cities. The Central Valley, all the agriculture there, as well as the big cities there. Fresno is bigger than Oakland. And the issues of concern there, immigration patterns, different majority, minority communities all over the state. All our various issues, homelessness, of course, in the big cities, different parts of the big cities. And yet, here in Oakland, we're right over the hill from some of the suburbs in Contra Costa County, and all the issues around housing density, housing development, just heavy debates going on over things like that. Our traditional debates over water, continue to go on. I think too, of course, every place, every community has its own particular identity and pride, and not wanting to lump, all of Southern California with LA, of course. The Inland Empire, the whole Riverside area, which is one of the fastest growing areas in California. Every distinct community has its own story, its own history, things they're proud of, issues they're working through, things to appreciate. So, just wanting to learn more about that. Really looking forward, if I'm selected, to spending time all over the state, learning more about
2 minutes remaining.
Those parts of the state.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and thank you, Dr. Yee. I think in the interest of time, I'll ask one more question really quickly. And if you were to be appointed to the role of commissioner, which aspects of that role do you think that you will enjoy the most? And conversely, which aspects of that role do you think might cause you to struggle a little bit?
Sure. This is a little abstract, but I think what I would enjoy the most, actually and truthfully, is being part of something that's such a great idea. I just love the idea of the commission, and the risky proposition that it was, back in 2008, and the fact that it's been done once now so well, and it's a model for the nation. I just love that. So I would really enjoy that. I also would really enjoy just learning about our state more, and more stories about life all over our state. Something challenging. I think the open meeting laws, I respect them, I understand them, the need for them. That's what we intend to keep to them, in letter and in spirit. But I know that they can be frustrating as well to have discussions. I remember being on a jury some years ago where we couldn't discuss, I think I mentioned this, we couldn't discuss the case for 9 weeks. It was just really difficult. Here, it's a different situation, but having to have all discussions in open, not being able to have private conversations that might offer themselves, I think would be frustrating. I'd also find it very frustrating if there were any disunity on the commission. Anyone who, wasn't a team player, any, division that way, that would be very frustrating for me as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yee. I think we're about out of time, so I will go ahead and turn the time over to Ms. Dickinson for her questions. Ms. Dickinson?
Thank you, Mr. Ko.
Thank you, Mr. Ko. Good morning, Dr. Yee.
Morning.
So you just talked about one of the things that would frustrate you was if there was disunity among the commissioners. What are some of the things the commissioners can do early on to build a team and an atmosphere of collaboration?
Right. So it's a little tricky because, of course, you have the 8 that will be initially selected by lottery. I think the former commission called those the luckies, and those luckies will pick 6 more, which will be the chosen, as they call them. And so right from the start, you'll have a division that will need to be overcome. And I think one of the things that we'll need to do is make those selections of the final 6 as early as possible, as early as it can be done well. And so not have a minimum of experiences that only the 8 will have, that the 6 will not have, and really try to have the whole commission, all 14, experience, the formative early going of the commission. So I think one of the issues that the former commission experienced was some of the Voting Rights Act training happened before the final 6 were selected, and in retrospect, that was not ideal. So to do that, I think certainly to socialize, even outside of the official meetings, just who you chat with, who you sit down for a meal with, and to really mix that up and maybe make a very intentional, mini project of that as a commission. I think, when personal relationships can be cultivated, it adds a lot to, to motivation and willingness to do something not only for the sake of the commission and the sake of our duties, but for the sake of the personal relationships that can develop on the commission and the personal, loyalties to the whole commission, all the commissioners that can develop. So those are some of the things I would think would be important early on.
Thank you. So I wanted to touch on your diversity essay. You talked about, you teach a class about Oakland.
Yes.
And you said you delight in replacing simplistic ideas about Oakland with a wide appreciation for Oakland's vast diversity. What motivates you to educate about that and that changing that perspective?
Sure. I love teaching that class. Actually, behind me you see the plaque, Oakland, and its iconic oak tree. That's actually it was a student project. A student made that for me. I love it. From that class. What motivates me? I guess at two levels. One is just personally, I love my city, the same way I love California, and I want it to be understood. I want to correct incorrect ideas about it. I want people to be able to learn from it. I want people to visit it. The college where I teach that class is St. Mary's College of California, which is in Moraga, right over the hill. Right through the Caldecott Tunnel from Oakland. And so my feeling is that these students are going to spend 4 years there at St. Mary's College, and they should get to know the largest city they will spend those 4 years next to. And, so that they'll be invited, feel, that that's part of their college experience. Spend time in Oakland and learn from Oakland and, get a better education because of that time in and next to Oakland. And then I hope it'll expand their imagination as they think about their futures and their opportunities. And the motto of St. Mary's is come to learn, go to serve, And so, of course, Oakland, like all big cities, has a especially wide range of opportunities to serve, to think about nonprofit careers, to think about volunteer opportunities that these students may pursue. So that motivates me a lot. But a lot of it is just because I love stories and I love diversity and I love history and I love teaching about those. In my class evaluations, one of the feedback items I frequently get is simply that the professor is very enthusiastic. It makes coming to class more motivating. And that's a very genuine enthusiasm. And so I love to share that, and it motivates me to teach the class.
Thank you. You've talked also about being a runner. What have you learned from running outside of Oakland and visiting in those communities that will assist the commission in reaching out to communities in the various regions of California?
Right. So I think, when you run, you just have a very granular sense of a place because you see it, right up close, not just whizzing by in a car. And so you see houses and front yards and people's, cars and what's on their front porches. And you see also the condition of public works. You're very intimately acquainted with the condition of the roads, sidewalks. You can tell instantly whether a setting is pedestrian friendly. You see places in town that are thriving. You see places in town that may be fading away. You read signs, you read plaques. I love finding history plaques and reading them, and learning the story of places. You also get an intimate sense of geography, boundaries, and you can really feel viscerally how it feels like to cross a freeway, or cross a train track, and how the neighborhood changes. You also notice a lot of landmarks, the schools, the churches, City Hall, businesses, businesses that are thriving, businesses that are not, and so forth. And so I think that sensitivity, that sensibility, that perceptiveness about a community that you really can't get just from numbers or from reading a report, hopefully can help the commission and its work.
Thank you. So in the class you teach about Oakland, you talk about looking or using historical census figures. And then you also talk about enjoying geography trivia. So have you done any work or any trivia where you've combined those two, census data and maps or geography?
I have not combined census data and maps and geography professionally, but certainly in the teaching for the Oakland class, we look at maps and I show different, patterns of housing, and it's just it's a golden age for maps and data, and there are maps available where you can show, the race of every voter in a city, and analyze that and discuss that, and so I do that in class. Other ways. Just out of curiosity, I suppose, just kind of a hobbyist level, looking at cities, looking at California and learning. And then most recently, working through some of those US Census Online Academy modules and learning how to use their system to analyze maps and data.
So given your joy of geographic trivia, you also talked about some of the boundary lines.
Sure.
In your essay. Would a district that was shaped oddly give you concern? Why or why not?
Indeed. So an oddly shaped district, of course, the question is, what is oddly? And I've read some of the discussions and essays and reports that have tried to define oddness. And, I think the commission will be bound by the 6 constitutional criteria, ranked criteria, population, Voting Rights Act, communities of interest, contiguity, and then 5th, which is pretty low down the list, is compactness. So I think the language is that there should not be pockets of population farther out included to the exclusion of pockets of population that are farther in. So, but that is a consideration, that is a criterion that will be in tension sometimes with communities of interest, right? So, would it bother me? Aesthetically, of course, one can, there seems to be a human propensity to like tidiness and symmetricalness. On the other hand, in terms of the constitutional redistricting criteria, oddness is not a criteria. So it's just balancing the criterion of compactness with all the other criteria. So basically, no, not in and of itself, not oddness in and of itself. Of course, gerrymandering, the whole long history of gerrymandering, oddness has been part of that, kind of that, I know it when I see it kind of criterion. And so, there's some of that, but not inherently, no.
Thank you. You mentioned communities of interest being one of the criterion. That is on the same level with cities, counties, and neighborhoods.
Yes.
What can the commission do to ensure that when it's weighing those different things, when they come in conflict with each other, that they're making the right decisions?
I think that's an excellent question. That's probably going to be the $64,000 question for the commission. Communities of interest, I think of the 6 criteria, that's probably going to be the most challenging one because it's the most fuzzy one. And so on one hand, you have clear existing boundaries, city, county boundaries. You have natural, features, lakes, rivers, the Bay here in the Bay Area, and so forth. But when it comes to some of the other considerations, economic activity and historic voting patterns, those are going to be difficult. And so it's going to take a lot of research. How to make the right decision, I don't think it's going to be a question of right or wrong so much as a question of better or worse, because there's going to be lots of options. I think I would be guided a lot by, the first thing I would do probably for any given decision is look at the 2010 Commission's work and look at the discussions they had, look at the considerations they lined up, weigh those, see if they still hold the same weight, make adjustments where populations have changed, and then try to make a good decision. I like the phrase, let's see, it was in the, so part of the language for the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, talks about the totality of circumstances. I think it's the Jingles preconditions. Totality of circumstances, and I like that phrase, and I think for communities of interest, that's part of the challenge, will be to try to take in the totality of circumstances and to make a better decision, a good decision. Not the only right decision, because I don't think there will be an only right decision.
Thank you. What do you see as your role on the commission should you be selected?
My role on the commission, as I mentioned, number one, to show up, and my intention to show up to 100% of the commission meetings and even to be available if extra trips or extra duties become necessary. I intend to be available for that. I intend to be an excellent listener. I take notes as I listen, and I love to summarize what's been said. I see my role as trying to clearly state, what's been said and try to clearly summarize what's been said, summarize arguments, point out things that may not have been, things that might have been missing. I see my role as trying to steer the commission back to its goal if we get distracted. The goal is to have these public input meetings, to hear from the public, and then to draw these 4 maps on time using the 6 ranked criteria. That's the goal. And there's lots of other interesting things we can be doing, lots of other things to be discussing, but to steer the commission back to that. Certainly just to try to contribute to the commission's good judgment when it comes to hiring and directing staff and consultants. That's going to be a lot of the work. So to try to add to those discussions, be an asset to those discussions. And as well, simply to enjoy the experience, to add to the enjoyment of the experience, and to find ways for the commission to enjoy each other's work and company, and, to make it a positive year for everyone. I want to contribute to that.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier in our discussion that one of the things you would like to see is that the 6 commissioners be selected early in the process. If you were selected as one of the first 8, what would you look for in those 6 individuals?
Right. So, right off, I would look for trying to fill any obvious gaps in the range of commissioners. So especially for geography, urban, rural, suburban, men and women. So, try to fill those gaps, racial backgrounds, try to fill those gaps. I would look for, the qualities you've emphasized, impartiality, analytical ability, appreciation for diversity. Look for a team player. Look for someone who's motivated and available to do the work necessary. Technical skills, of course, those are valuable. I can't get over that the 2010 Commission was fortunate to have Vince Barbera, a former U.S. Census Director, two-time Census Director. I think he was actually picked in the lottery, but if he had been available for one of the six, the chosen six, I think he was certainly a very, very attractive candidate to bring that kind of background to the work. But certainly, legal background, data background, mapping background, community work backgrounds to look for how those might add to the commission.
Thank you.
We have 2 minutes, 50 seconds remaining.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coe, I don't have any further questions at this point.
Thank you, Ms. Dickinson. We'll go ahead and turn the time over to Mr. Belknap.
Thank you, Mrs. Dickinson.
Good morning, Dr. Yee.
Mr. Belknap.
I want to start my questions with just going way back to the early 80s. You studied nutrition and, well, you graduated with a bachelor's in nutrition and food and science from UC Berkeley. Why did you go into that degree, and what was your intention in terms of a career in that area?
Wow, way back. Thank you, Mr. Belknap. It is Throwback Thursday, isn't it? At the time, I didn't have a clear idea at all of a direction professionally. I was among a lot of high school peers who were interested in science professions or medicine, perhaps, careers like that. And so that seemed interesting to me. I had a personal friend who had a few years older who had done the nutrition program at UC Berkeley. And at the time, it just seemed to me that, no matter what else I did in life, nutrition would be part of my life, part of the world, something worth understanding. And so I went into that, maybe with some pre-med thoughts. And it was worthwhile. I had a good experience in it. But I did discover later that even though I was able to do the science, and science was very interesting, and I'm glad I did that. I'm especially glad now because, as it happens, my wife is a physician, and so having that science background helps me understand her work and things that she does better. But I found actually that my interests and my temperament and personality actually was more towards things like writing and things like history and things like culture and narratives and things like that. And so I would chalk it all up to youthfulness and some influences in my life and the availability of the program at Berkeley, and just kind of the sense that this is something worth knowing about. And that's what motivated me at the time.
Okay, thank you. I know you graduated with a master's in Old Testament from the Dallas Theological Seminary. Does that mean, in number of years attended was 4, does that mean you lived in Texas for those 4 years?
I did. I lived in Dallas, Texas for those 4 years. And, it's the South, my first time in the South. It's Bible Belt. It's a very different place, And I remember early in my time there opening up the Dallas Morning News. And at that time, President Reagan was in office. And there was a pro-President Reagan editorial in the Dallas Morning News. I don't think I'd ever seen that in the papers around here. So a very different part of the world. Came to love the people there and love Southern hospitality and the sense of family there. Really enjoyed that. But also came to appreciate California all the more and realize that what we have here is very special and not to be taken for granted. The diversity, the natural beauty. Certainly the Asian presence here in California goes much further back, and it's much more diverse than what I experienced there in Dallas. So yeah, it was very eye-opening, good experience, but also glad to be back here in California.
So before entering the seminary, at some point you must have decided that going into being a pastor was where your life was headed. Can you tell us about that decision?
Sure. Part of that was, so I've mentioned before, I'm drawn to gaps. What's missing? What needs to be done that isn't being done? And part of my decision to go to seminary in the first place was actually not professional. The church I was at the time in Oakland, the church my family attended and that I grew up in, we had a pastor at that time who encouraged young people there to, as they got their college degrees and perhaps graduate degrees, that in that mix, that they include some higher education in religion, in matters of faith. And his reasoning was, you're going to get all educated in all these other parts of your life. You should, have some education in this part of your life as well, no matter what profession you're in. It's similar to, I think, some of the, centuries ago, the origins of some of the Ivy League colleges, Harvard and so forth, that all had, such training, in religion as part of their curricula for all their students, because to be educated, to be part of a community, that's part of what you should know about. So that's what initially motivated me. It wasn't initially a professional decision, but as I progressed in my seminary career, I came to realize that there was a gap in church leadership among Asian Americans. The majority of Asian American churches in America are still pastored by overseas-born, first-generation immigrant leaders. Even though, for instance, for Chinese, we've been here over 150 years, and yet the majority of Chinese American pastors are first-generation, not American-born pastors, and there's a huge gap. Because, of course, once the first generation has arrived, every generation after that is American. I was born here. So a huge gap, and I saw that gap, and it weighed on me. And so that's when I decided to help try to fill that gap and make it not only an experience of enriching my life, but as a professional direction as well.
All right, thank you. So after getting a certificate in Anglican Studies, it looks like from your employment history, you became a pastor at New Life Christian Fellowship for 10 years.
That's right.
So, and you were also later a pastor at another church. So that leads to my next question. How has your experience as a pastor increased your understanding and appreciation for California's diversity?
Yes. So, as a pastor, you circulate in church circles and you talk to people about their spiritual lives and commitments and community involvement in their churches. And so that whole world, and as I mentioned before, for me, it's a wide world, more conservative, more liberal, different churches all over, helps me to understand those parts of people's lives. When I look out at Oakland has a very diverse religious landscape. I love where I live is actually right down the hill from our, there's a large Greek Orthodox church right next to Latter-day Saints Temple, right down the street from a newer Ethiopian Orthodox church. We have all our historically black churches in Oakland, mainline churches, evangelical churches, immigrant churches, and that whole world is familiar to me, and I circulate in those circles, and I understand people and their attachments and commitments to those settings, and of course other religions as well. So in Oakland, we have somewhat newer Buddhist temples, and some mosques, and so forth. So I think just understanding that part of people's lives, certainly the more conservative parts of the state, Central Valley and so forth, the large churches and the roles that they play in their communities of interest, is familiar territory to me, and something that I think if someone from the public who's part of a setting like that, wanted to share, they would find in me someone who could understand and respond to their interests and their concerns, with some skill and personal background.
Okay, thank you. So you entered your time as pastor in 2001 and then became an associate pastor in 2007. So there's a 6-year gap there that I want to ask about. But first, 10 years is a long time. Maybe your service was up, but why did you end? Why did you stop being the pastor in 2001 for the New Life Christian Fellowship?
Sure. So New Life, by the way, that was the church where we made that big denominational decision that I talked about earlier. So during those 10 years I was at New Life, I was not full-time there. I was actually teaching as well. So after my doctoral studies, I wanted to be mostly pastoring but also teaching. And so I was teaching that whole time during those 10 years. In the course of those 10 years, I learned more about myself and learned more about pastoring and teaching, and realized that my gifts were actually more towards teaching than pastoring. I think in my life, the way I'm wired, kind of the more structured nature of teaching fit me better, and I had better energy for that and more skill. I was actually able to be more pastoral as a professor, I found. And so near the end of those 10 years of New Life, as I looked at the church, they actually wanted me to stay on, but it seemed to me that my gifts and interests were not what they needed most for going to the next step. They needed a different leader, somebody perhaps with a different skill set than I had. And so that's why I wrapped it up there, turned to mostly teaching. My later associate pastor position was at the church I'm at now, and I was on staff for a few years when they were younger and smaller, and so, but still mostly teaching at that time. So I haven't been doing just one thing all those years. Some, on paid staff at churches, doing lots of volunteer things, as well as teaching.
Now tell me more about the teaching. I don't know if I see that in front of me. Where were you teaching?
So, as it happens right now in American higher education, it's hard to believe, but the majority of classes are taught by what's called contingent faculty. Contingent faculty are either graduate students or faculty that are not tenure track who are hired to teach a class. And so that's been my role, mostly in adjunct and in associate appointments. And so teaching, in recent years, my main appointment was at Voter Theological Seminary, which is based in Pasadena. It's actually the largest Protestant seminary in the world. And teaching in-person classes, and then more recently teaching mostly online classes. So teaching there as well as other schools. Did some teaching for a small seminary in Southern California and then other settings. So.
And what were the subjects that you teach or taught?
So at the seminaries, I've taught mostly in the what's called Pastoral Ministry. So that's the work of pastoring other than preaching. And so a lot of pastoral care, leadership, building teams. My particular interest is in Christian worship, and so that's the history of that, the cultural nature of it, how it's developed over time, theology of it, of course. And so teaching in those areas. And I find what motivates me most is actually that cultural angle of teaching and trying to help students appreciate it more, have more tools for thinking about it, talking about it, helping. So right now I'm actually involved with the Asian American Center at Voter Theological Seminary. And I find a lot of my work there helps students kind of find their own voice and think about their own stories and, what does it mean to pastor or be in ministry in Asian American settings? How does it work? Trying to integrate themselves into the majority culture and questions like that. So it's been most of my teaching.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, can I get a time check?
Yes, 6 minutes, 15 seconds remaining.
Okay. Now I'd like you to walk us through an example of a complex analysis you've performed in either your work or academic experience.
Conflict, is that a conflict?
No, complex.
Complex analysis. Wow. I suppose my mind immediately goes to my doctoral research, the research in my doctoral program, which was Socio-Linguistic Analysis, different approaches to Christian worship. So looking at Sunday worship and examining the difference between settings that are liturgical. So they have service books, I guess you could call it a script, for their service, written prayers. Comparing that with all the traditions that don't use written liturgies, that are more extemporaneous in their approach to their worship. And so this was a sociolinguistic analysis, and I used various models, including one called diglossia, looking at different ways that settings use language. And so I had to look at lots of different language samples and critiques of those and analyses of those, and come up with a theory of the nature of the use of language in such settings and how formal and informal language relate to each other in those settings. So that was a big project. Data analysis, complex analysis. I do think of my running. It's an incredibly quantitative process, marathon racing and training. There's all these sources of advice and plans, and you have to analyze them. You have to do a lot of quantitative work as well as qualitative work, and look at evidence, not just take things at face value, compare things, talk to people, decide on a plan, execute that plan, evaluate it. And so doing that for myself and doing that with others, a lot of complex analysis.
So, Madam Secretary, how much time do I have?
3 minutes, 50 seconds, 50.
So I want to come back to the linguistic analysis that you performed. Where did you get your information about the various forms of worship and the language used?
It's a very tricky matter because for the liturgical traditions, of course, you have written, published, authorized liturgies. And so you have these, these published sources, on paper that you can analyze. And then, of course, you go into their settings and you actually listen and look at those settings. For the extemporaneous traditions, it's much trickier. So, of course, you visit them, you look at transcripts, you talk to people, you ask them how they approach, you talk to worship leaders and ask them how they approached deciding what they're going to say. And so you collect data that way and try to analyze it as best you can. But that was definitely a challenge.
Okay. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Belknap.
Thank you, Mr. Belknap. Mr. Dawson.
Thank you, Mr. Coe. Good morning. Well, it's now afternoon, Dr. Yee. Just a couple follow-up questions. In your response to standard question 1, you mentioned that you were had dived into the online academy of the census. Is that intended to help users of census data?
That's correct. So the U.S. Census, it's a little messy right now because they're actually transitioning from their older platform, which was American Fact Finder, to a newer platform, which is at data.census.gov. So it's for the general public as well as for any specialists or professionals to just learn how to navigate census data and make good use of it. And so, helpful videos and tutorials for how to do that.
Oh, thank you. It's kind of a broad question. What can the history of Oakland teach us about the history of California generally, and how would that perspective be useful to the commission?
Wow. Oh my goodness. I think what's the starting point is realizing that every place has an incredibly complex and multifaceted story behind it. There, one of the very first things I always start with in my Oakland class is a unit on dispelling the idea of a single story. You cannot explain any place with a single story. And it's not that those single stories are not true necessarily. The trouble is that they don't tell the whole story, right? So right now, one of the big debates in Oakland and a lot of our big cities involves gentrification, right? And it's housing debates. And you could say, well, this is the whole story of Oakland right now. It's, you know, newcomers with money displacing longtime residents with less money, you know, and that is part of our story. But that's, you know, just one fraction of our story. So I think Oakland and its history, immigration, changes, dramatic changes, you know, historically Oakland actually was a very conservative town, and changed a lot. It's changed, you know, dramatically 2 or 3 times in its history. So just an appreciation for the complexity of places and stories, as well as you know, Native American backgrounds and presence, and the importance of all those things apply to the state as a whole as well.
All right, thank you. I have no further follow-ups.
Thank you, Mr. Dawson.
Ms. Dickinson, any follow-up questions?
I have no follow-up questions.
Mr. Belknap?
No further follow-up questions.
Mr. Dawson, I don't have any further follow-up
All
questions
right,
either.
thank you. Madam Secretary, how much time is remaining in the 90 minutes?
4 minutes, 5 seconds
All right.
remaining.
Thank you. Dr. Yee, with the time remaining, I'd like to give you the opportunity to make some closing remarks to the panel if you wish.
I do wish. Thank you. Thank you all for persevering in this very impressive and long process of the selection phase of the Redistricting Commission. I'm just really inspired by your work and by this process. And I have full confidence that whoever eventually ends up on the commission, the 14, the lucky and the chosen, that they will do excellent work. And you know, of course, I would love to be part of that work, but if I'm not, I will have full confidence in the work of the commission. As I think about the work of the 2010 commission, and then even further back, the 2008 proposition that led to this commission, it's hard to remember just how unlikely it all was. You know, I think the good work of the 2010 commission makes it seem inevitable, but it was not inevitable. It's not even likely. And I'm just thrilled to be part of a state where we pulled this off. You know, and pulled it off well once, and I would like to help it pull it off well again. And as I read the news every day, as I'm really heartbroken over the polarization in our nation, the heavy debates, and some of the discouraging developments around voting rights. You know, being at a poll worker last month and seeing up close and personal what the low voter turnout that is typical, sadly, for us looks like. You know, as I was at the precinct there, just being kind of heartbroken about that low voter turnout. All our debates about the Electoral College and so forth. In the midst of all that, we have this success of California citizen nonpartisan redistricting as a light and as a positive development in our recent history. And so I would love to be part of this important work. And so I just thank you, Mr. Coe, Mr. Belknap, Ms. Dickinson, Mr. Dawson, the staff there, interpreters, the secretary, our video friend. Everybody, thank you so much for your time. Please stay safe, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yee, for taking the time to speak with us this morning and afternoon a little bit. Our next interview is scheduled for 1:15, so we will go into recess until 1:14.